Aquaba.
Thank you.
I'm Dr. Gloria Lattimore, Peace, host and producer of OmniU Presents the H3O Art of Life show, and I am delighted to have my guest, Dr. Asantewaa Oppong Wadie, who is going to talk to us about Black History Interrupted, the Maafa, and so on. And the reason I'm saying and so on is because I took a look again at your presentation at the Woodson Regional Library most recently. And the first thing you said was that we needed essentially a vocabulary. There's just, we have not yet come up with a term that encapsulates all of what the Black experience was during that period when we were under siege, kidnapped, turned into captives, and having our land, our culture, our language, our kinship group all stolen from us. So we call it Maafa for now, but you had suggested at least one other term that could be used. So go ahead and talk about that.
Yeah, this past spring I was on the island of St. Croix, and a very lovely sister there mentioned the word to me, manganese.
Spell it.
Well, it is a Swahili word, so it's spelled as it sounds, although I don't want to spell it wrong for television.
Okay.
But she told me that that term is closer to what we need than Maafa, because in the term manganese is the concept that there was an intent. It was by design, that it was calculated, that it was not random. It was not an excusable accident. It was a deliberate attempt to unseat a civilization for the purpose of building a new one. And it captures intent and doesn't leave the listener wondering if perhaps the perpetrators of this just awful period in human history, just maybe they didn't know.
So it was not something that befell African people. It was not something, it was not an event. It was a process
Yes.
that was deliberately concocted
Yes.
for the objectives that it served,
Yes.
which was where we started
That's
with, going among free Black people,
That's right.
robbing them of their ancestral land, separating them, kidnapping them and separating them from their kinsmen, their history, their culture, their language, their spirituality, everything that is essential to life. So we have to admit that words can hardly convey what it is we're here to talk about. One other thing I want to say before you can begin to talk as long as you like,
Okay.
and that is whenever you hear Black history, it's almost always equated with slavery, as though nothing ever happened until some adults walked down a gangplank from a ship in chains. They apparently were born on this ship,
Right.
and they grew up on this ship,
Exactly.
and then they walked down the gangplank into, quote, the new world, without taking heed of the fact that these people have a beginning.
That's right.
They have a history. They have a civilization, not just a culture, but African people, having been the first people, are the originators of civilization.
Of world civilization.
Of
Correct.
world civilization.
That's right.
So it's always important that we in our conversations with each other and with other people, we always have to raise the question, what about before
This happened.
this period that Hunter Adams has a better name for? You have, in fact, embellished it, so why don't you mention that? The labor extraction.
Right. Well, several things. Well, Dr. Hunter Adams has come up with the term criminal labor extraction to describe this period that most people refer to as slavery. And I said, you know, that is a wonderful direction because we're moving closer. Sometimes it will take a traumatized people several generations to even begin to talk about what actually happened to them, much less heal. So we're in that process, and he has given us a very vital tool in that process. But I said, let's expand it. It wasn't only a labor extraction, it was a cultural extraction. And so human bondage is not African history. Human bondage and forced labor interrupted African history. And I heard the reggae artist Muta Maruka make this point really clearly. Do not associate the period of Africa's demise with its history. Because one thing that is vital, Dr. Peace, is to understand how oppression happens. Oppression, you cannot oppress a people who have hold of their narrative. You have to remove the narrative. You've got to take the story away, because the story encapsulates everything about them and gives them directions going forward, gives them the vehemency to fight you if necessary for what they need. So if I'm going to get you to serve me, I have to remove your story. And then I have to put in place a false story that informs you that this is the best you can do for yourself. You know, and so that's kind of what we see happening. Not kind of, that's what we see happening when we hear the history of African people being told from the beginning of human bondage and Africa's contact with Europe is the removal of a narrative. And so that's systematic. They know what is being done when that is done. The end goal there is to keep a captured people captured.
And the important thing that you just said, the thing I focused in on immediately, is captive. We must understand that free people are not slaves.
That's right.
And when you capture them, when you kidnap them, what you have are captives. You do not have slaves.
That's right.
And you are not a master.
That's right.
They are captives and you are a captor. So
Right.
the fact that our people understood that they were captives made them continue to resist.
Right, every step of the way.
Because when you're captive, you're being held against your will. You know it is against your will. And it is that narrative to which you refer that gives you another reason for your captivity.
That's right.
You were cursed. You remember the Hamitic myth?
Yes.
Okay. You were cursed. Noah's sons gazed upon his nakedness. Ham was the one who was cursed. All of his line were cursed to be not only the drawers of water and the hewers of wood, but to be black people.
That's right.
So here we come with this narrative of this, your lot comes out of divine order.
That's right.
God put you in this condition, and the only way that you can ever hope to have any peace in this condition is servants obey your masters.
Right, right.
So you got a different relationship rather than from the captive and the captor. You got the master and the slave relationship. Once a captive begins to think of himself as a slave,
Right.
his will is
It's
demolished.
surrender. Yeah. And as Carter G. Woodson says, no one has to bring you to the back door. You will create that back door. And if it's not there, you're going to make it. Because you feel, you're the thing in you that your will, I think that's the right term. Once it's smashed, then you're at the whim, you're at the mercy of a very merciless
Well,
system.
can you imagine being given a narrative in which God is punishing you
Right.
for some unknown transgression.
That's
You
right.
are on your own land, minding your own business. People came among you. You were hospitable to these people. You treated them as though they were human beings, and you were accustomed to having conflict from time to time with your neighbors, but it was never the kind of conflict where you would deprive another neighbor of his humanity.
That's
You
right.
might make him work for you for a period of time as his punishment, but not take people into captivity for generations to come.
That's right. And so we get with this transatlantic criminal process, we get for the first time this concept of chattel human
Property.
bondage. Yes, you're now property.
Mm-hmm.
You're not
A person.
a person. You're not a person. And you will hear them state when you go back and read the original journals and diaries, even some of the legal documents that come out of that period in American history, they will say, this is my property, unequivocally.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it is as though they too went into a trance to accepting the fact that you could own someone.
Well, it appears to me that they didn't have to go into a trance. It appears to me that that was a part of a worldview that they held, and that was that things unlike themselves were not of their same group.
Right.
So you had, once you get into classification, once you get into categorizing, once you get into hierarchies,
That's right.
where this is more valuable than this, then you have the possibilities that you have human beings who are reduced to the extent that they are reduced right out of the human community.
That's right. And I think you draw an important point. There's several institutions in the United States that created this way of thinking and embedded it so deeply that today, 2013, we're still dealing with it. We have the church, one, a main culprit, unfortunately involved in very unholy activity, which is debasing of a human being. We have major academic institutions putting out science, or what we should call pseudoscience, articles and information, confirming the fact that these are not human beings. And they know the human proclivity is to believe people who are learned.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have the government also making laws, making statements. You have presidential diaries and statements. Presidents of the United States who themselves are owners of African people, or so-called owners, as if someone could be owned. I mean, a bunch of institutions conspired to create the very toxic mindset that is still in the American culture today.
Private ownership of property, you know, the whole idea that you can own land.
Yeah,
You know,
very foreign.
You know, it's foreign to non-European people.
That's right.
And it was foreign to the indigenous people who were here.
That's
You
right.
know, the mere idea that you come and try to buy land from us, we understand that is our ancestral land, but it is a gift that is given to us, and we are custodians. We are not
That's
owners, and we cannot sell you this land.
That's right. And you get the concept in African culture even today that the land belongs to the next generation. And, you know, and when that generation is born, they will also say the land belongs to the next generation. So always, as you said, we are just custodians of it. But in Europe, we get this mighty push for wealth, this mighty push for power that equals world power and the ability to influence things on the world stage. And in that race, they will throw people off of land, kill people, do heinous things that are absolutely criminal.
Absolutely inhuman.
Yes, yes, and speaks to a lack of humanity.
Right.
Absolutely.
So here we are with thousands of years, you know, the oldest remains, human remains on the planet were found in Africa.
That's
Both
right.
the oldest and the next oldest.
That's
were
right.
found, the woman they called Lucy, you know.
Yes.
We're talking millions of years here.
That's right.
We're talking people who have long history on the planet
That's
and who
right.
obviously had some ideas about how to relate to the planet, or else they would be in as much trouble as we are presently.
That's
In
right.
this, I mean, this country is, you know, not even 500 years old, and it's already in trouble with its economy, and it's running out of fuel,
That's
and it's
right.
running out of this, and they talk about overpopulation. There's not enough land, there's not enough food, there are too many people, and all of this in 500 years,
Yeah, and
you have
look,
managed to exhaust all the
how is that?
resources
Right.
that you have present on this land, on this continent, as well as all the resources that you have access to all over the
world.
globe.
Oh,
Now, who can consume
that much, that
that
fast.
much that fast?
Yeah. And I think the shameful thing is that, real basic things, like you can't drink the water. You cannot drink the water that is
Comes
in the
from your
lakes and
faucet.
rivers. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And it's pumped into your house. It's not healthy for you to consume that. And you can't breathe the air in most of the major cities.
And now that we have GMO modified, genetically modified organisms in food,
Yeah,
the food is even
also
a challenge.
working against us. How did you, and they're not even 300 years old, in less than 300 years, make such a mess? Make such a mess.
And how did they do it? The question I ask always, and you'll be talking about this a little bit later when you talk about how they selected, they handpicked
Yes.
the people to come that they wanted to bring here to do certain kinds of work and fulfill certain kinds of needs. How, with the most experienced, the most ancient, the most intelligent, the most creative people on the planet, how with that population as your captives and your unpaid servants, did you manage not to be able to build a sustainable nation?
Right.
I mean, you had all the resources and all of the expertise.
Right.
How have you squandered all of that?
Yeah. Well, mostly because you put yourself in the position of authority and them in the position of help,
Okay.
and not in the position of authority.
Okay.
So they definitely weren't here to teach. Very little was to be learned, intentionally learned anyway. And so let me do my idea. Like the bully. I
Right.
want it this way.
Right.
And then you run everything aground.
Right.
Yeah. You throw all of the world off kilter.
Well, here we are in this man-made, quote, culture, quote, civilization, which leaves a lot to be desired.
Mm-hmm.
And you can only know what is possible if you can look back and see what has been.
That's right.
And when we look back over African history, when we look back to Kemet,
That's right.
and when we look back to the empires that were built on African soil,
Right.
then we know that it is quite possible to have a different world.
That's right.
And therefore we need to explore what our experience has been so that we can look forward to
A better future.
a better future and to
Right.
and to recreating that, because if we've done it, we can do it again.
That's right.
And that's the thing that gives me so much hope, that we still, although we've been through this long period of having our will usurped
That's right.
by others, we still remain able to recall. I think it's in our cultural genes.
That's right.
I think it's in the DNA,
Yes.
that ability to improvise, to make a way out of no way. I do
Yeah.
think that. But you talk about the wonderfulness of Africa, you know, how we were these beautifully blessed people, and people saw that, and rather than wanting to share it, they wanted to come and own it.
That's right. It's almost as though Africa's prosperity gave way to its demise, which is unfortunate. But one of the things we notice when we look at Nile Valley civilization and the waves and waves of conquerors that came, and some which were beaten and sent back, and others that were successful, is that people were envious of the abundance that the Nile brought and the agriculture that the people knew. And agriculture becomes the basis of civilization. Just strictly from a Western perspective, the word civilization means a society that rises above the need for everyone to farm their own food or do subsistence farming. And it gives way to another class of people who can be, say, writers or leather workers, because their food is going to be provided. And the only way that we've ever been able to do that, this is human beings on the planet, is through agriculture. Because one farmer can feed a lot of people with his effort, and then food can be stored to get through a dry season.
It can be preserved.
So agriculture is the backbone of civilization. Following it closely is animal husbandry, knowing how to keep cattle, and understand that all of this science came out of Africa. And although Africans walked all over the globe and spread their knowledge freely, still the conquerors came. They wanted the valley. They wanted authority in Africa. They wanted to be in the house of the rising sun.
They wanted the birthright
That's
of the
right.
African.
Absolutely. And much like the biblical story, put on a false coat to disguise themselves as such, as the people who had the right to the throne. I always ask my students, how come Alexander, the so-called great, but let's just call him Greek because that's what he was, how come he came into Africa and one, set his major library and center of learning in Africa? Why did he do that? If there was nothing in Africa except roaming animals and people
And
with
wild
spears,
people.
running behind the animals, why would he do that? Why would Alexander the Greek leave the coastal areas of Africa where he came from, Greece, on one of the islands there? Why would he march into the desert to find an oracle and ask that oracle, you know, who is my real father? Am I a child of all men? And seek to get permission to be called a child of all men. And assume in some of his pictures the ram's horns on his head, saying that I am a child of all men. Why? Because the culture there was the sunshine of the world, literally. And everyone who came in contact with it understood that they were looking at something very highly evolved, and wanted to be a part of it.
Right.
So even in their birth, rites of passage and death rites, they imitated what they saw. They're in that Nile Valley. They imitated it. And we have Herodotus telling us, he said, all of the rites that we practice here. He writes this in his own writings from his journey into the Nile Valley. All of the rites that we practice have come out of Africa. All processions, he says, all ceremonies. And he said the people who are in what is called today Egypt are telling me that they have come from further down the Nile. But we know to say up the Nile that they're coming from Ethiopia, you know, ancient Nubia, Kush, Meroe.
Right.
Yeah, and he says all processions, and so I have my students kind of think about processions, like what you see in graduation, what you see in a wedding party. This whole idea of the marching in, following the almost like the stars of the heavens, because in Africa there was that axiom: as above, so below. Right. So all of that you see that happens around royalty, that happens around academicians, all the pomp,
All of that comes directly out of that culture.
and that gives us the best glimpse of what it must have been like. Of what it must have been like. I always ask my daughters, because I am so concerned about young children getting enamored with what they see on TV and not looking at themselves and looking into their culture to find the glory that they seek. You know, I ask them, how come European women dress up in long gowns on the nights that they're supposed to receive honors from, you know, the movies they make or songs they sell? How come they're in gowns on that day and not every other day? For some reason, when it's time for them to present, they always want to assume what was here before them. The long pleated, you know, intricate jewelry, and that gives us a glimpse into what they saw before they destroyed what we know of African history. This is what they saw. And that's how it struck them, as awesome, as beautiful, as worthy of imitation.
I always like to say similar things to young people. Why would you be impressed with a gold chain when you lived on a continent where you might stumble over a gold nugget in the night
That's
on your way
right.
to the bathroom?
That's right.
You know,
Right.
you can't, when you had gold mines, you know, when these resources, when diamonds were part of your environment, now all of a sudden you get something that's 5 carats and you carry it away because you have this one diamond.
That's
you
right.
know, so that you know, you cannot know you cannot place value on what you have until you know what you've lost.
It is, yeah. And that's the Resurrection Project, really, in my mind. That's what's going to lift African people in the diaspora and on the continent of Africa back to the place where we belong, is when we begin to engage in restorative work.
Right.
There's really no other task for us on the planet right now.
Right.
It's the only thing redemptive left for us to do.
Right. And I think
Is piece it back
I think
together.
That's a wonderful thought. You know, why do we keep trying to inhabit these things that are new, that are transient, that are actually the newer things are, generally speaking, the more shoddy they're likely to be in, you know, in the quality
That's right.
that you find. You know, you go to new houses and they have all of these laminate floors and
Right.
these other things that are giving off deadly toxic fumes, you
right,
know.
right.
So you get new things, but the new things are made out of inferior materials. Nothing is made of real wood. You've got all this fabricated wood and fabricated everything, and things that are imitations of real things, which is why you can have so many of them.
Right.
Because they're
can
not
be mass
real. You
produced.
you couldn't have, you know, this much real wood furniture in your house.
That's right.
You know?
Yeah, exactly.
Because you couldn't afford it in the first place, and it would take months and years to build it in the second place.
Yeah.
But we're so, you know, we are so so impressed usually with things that are superficial. We look at things from the outside. There's a book out by Tom Hartman called The Crash of 2016, in which he begins by saying that he read a science fiction story as a youth which had some astronauts traveling to the moon. And so when they got there, they wanted to go around the back and see the backside of the moon. And when they got around the back, they said, shall we tell them, shall we tell the people on Earth what we see? And the other one said, no, we can't tell them. Well, what it was that they couldn't tell them, that there was no backside to the moon, that it was hollow. Now, this is science fiction.
Yeah.
But in other words, the moon was actually a hollow sphere that was fabricated. It wasn't even real itself.
Wow.
And it had a backing of plywood and other kinds of things. The back of it was the plywood that was holding up the front.
Wow.
So there was no there.
Wow.
You see? And so when you look at this material world that we live in now, it's hollow like that.
Yes,
there is no essence there. There's no substance
meaning
there.
Yeah. And they gravitate to things that have meaning. I love to point out to young people, why is the new radio program called Sirius FM and has a dog with a star eye in it? Is that for the dog star called Sirius? From that was worshipped, and its astronomical and its scientific properties understood in the Nile Valley? Is that why? Now look at the Horamakit, which is usually a sun disk with wings on either side. And I point out, look at the symbol on Chrysler. And you will see it there. A culture that is empty and devoid of meaning and practices a casual worldview is going to gravitate to your culture because you are the light of the world. You are a city that is set on a hill. Your culture. And while you sleep, they will utilize your imagery, your story even, without you even knowing, because you don't know it.
Because you don't know your symbols. You don't. You walk around looking at African symbols all day, and you don't recognize that you're seeing them.
That's right.
In the same way that you drive around the United States, and you see all of these Indian names. All these towns and streets with all of these Indian names. These names are not taken out of thin air.
And they are used so disrespectfully of the culture that they are from, without regard for intellectual property rights or anything.
Well, nobody has any rights now. Come on. How are you going to claim intellectual property rights when you can't claim the right to yourself?
That's right. And it is as though in the using of other people's cultures and signs, they are saying, we can do it. We're here, we're the new kid on the block, and anything we want, we can take it. But we have the right to take it back.
Well, of course.
To say no.
Well, let's talk about how we got to fall on our knees, however. We had all of this greatness, and, people say, well, okay, if, Africa was all that great, why did we become subjects? And when you point out the vulnerability, and you are one of the few people, aside from folks that are well known, like Chancellor Williams and so forth, who wrote The Destruction of Black Civilization, of course, to talk about that period during which we were destabilized, where we were constantly under attack from everybody because they were envious of, as you pointed out, our abundance. So that we were battle weary. By the time we got taken over.
And so you witness a great retreat. And in my estimation, you'll still find African people on the run. Of course we are. We can live in the city today, and tomorrow I got to take the kids back to the, nowhere is safe. Our sense of home is just almost nowhere. You know what I'm saying? But invaders, Eurasians, started to come into Africa for the abundance of the Nile. And several battles and wars were waged, some successfully, some unsuccessfully. But as you say, it started making people retreat. Like, it's just not that serious. What is wrong with these people? Why do they fight so consistently? And so they started to retreat into deeper into Africa. And Cheikh Anta Diop says that, you know, we have some movement going west. We have movement coming to Central Africa, going south. We got movement going east. Just people retreating. Small bands of people, sometimes themselves ending up, because there are people under duress, having internal conflicts and breaking into even smaller bands of people with conflictual ideas, vulnerable because of lack of unity.
Because of lack of unity and organization.
Yes. And this is the world in which the Portuguese will step into in the 1400s.
When people are off balance.
Yes.
And
just
weakened
not, yes.
by hundreds of years.
Thousands.
Thousands of years.
Yes. Of consistent war and consistently having to run. And they will take full advantage of the vulnerability of the people. And if you look at the journals of the European persons that first entered Africa, one, I did this when I was an undergraduate student. It is amazing. It almost reads a little bit like pornography. They are so enamored with African women. It is amazing that they're able to convince African women today that for some reason something is wrong with her and she doesn't look good. Because they write cryptically about their admiration for African women. Two, they mention when they see divisions amongst people that we could take advantage of this. So this was a calculation. Oh, these are the enemies of these people. And Shillington, who writes The History of Africa, says that all I have to do then, once I know who your enemies are, is arm your enemies. Yeah. And then say, now what are you willing to give me for some guns?
And you point out that it was the gun.
Yes. As he says, the Maxine gun gave us Africa.
And when you go to Goree Island, you see this big cannon in the same way that when you go to Elmina, you see these big cannons right on the shore, you know, aimed out toward the ocean in case somebody might come, you know. And I think about the fact that here we unconsciously bring our experience to our language when we talk about being under the gun.
Wow.
Because that's a common popular expression. Man, I was under the gun. We lived under the gun. And when you point out how long, when you talk about calculating, and you pointed out how long for maybe 200 years they waited. They came, they lived among the people, they intermarried, they had children, and then they struck.
Yes. So it should never be felt that Europeans wanting to hold people in human bondage and forced labor came, and the next day they loaded ships. They lived there generationally. And most often intermarried, as you said, and had mixed race children and used those children to their advantage. And they kept a story going. So we see this new thing about this narrative that comes over with Europeans. They knew from day one that is what they wanted. But they also knew that in my lifetime I might not achieve that. So I must pass the story down. I must pass the codes for oppression on to the next generation. And they were successful in doing that. They succeeded in keeping a story alive, a mandate alive across several generations. Because when they had become friends of these kings and chiefs, then they said, we've been here a long time and we've married, you know, gently at first, let me have some of the people who you are holding as enemy
as
captives.
prisoners of war.
Yeah. Yeah.
So why not?
Yeah, why not? He's been amongst us.
Yeah.
We know him.
We fought him and he lost,
Right.
and now he has to serve us for a given period of time.
Right.
So why not?
Right. Why not? And one of the things we have as primary source evidence is the letter from King Alfonso, who was at that time the king in South Central Africa. And he had dealings with the Portuguese. And he writes to them and he says, okay, I agreed to give you some of my people, particularly those who I was holding as prisoners of war. But now you are breaching that agreement. You're just taking whoever you want.
Mm-hmm.
And you are taking randomly, you even are taking from people in our noble class, and you are just loading them on ships. We are asking for this to stop. That's one of the key letters that we have coming out of this era.
You think you could have a gentleman's agreement,
Right.
okay, that you obviously don't know that you are encroaching,
Right.
that you know, let me point it out to you.
Right.
Because you're not aware
Right.
of the damage you're doing.
Right. And in King Alfonso's case, he had even gone so far as to baptize, so as to make friends with this new and mounting power on the continent of Africa. Let me baptize, change my name to a Portuguese name, and become a Christian. So Christianity was really there before Africans were loaded on the ship, because the kings and chiefs saw it as a way to negotiate as a friend. And now I'm not alien to you. You know, I practice your culture. I've changed my name. I'm baptized to your God. Please be merciful and, you know, let us negotiate as equals. But that wasn't the case.
Well, you know, one of the things that I've thought about as you were talking about the prisoners of war is that Africans waged warfare differently.
Absolutely.
Because the whole idea of the warfare is to vanquish the enemy, not to destroy him.
Right.
You know, and they had prisoners of war. You know, the Europeans fought to demolish
Decimate.
everything
Yes.
in sight. Men, women, children, old, young, and in between.
Right.
Africans just wanted to defeat you enough so that you would know that you could not win this battle and you would go home.
That's right.
And then they would go back to their lives.
Right.
The sad thing was that they left some people standing.
That's right.
They left some people able to come back and fight another
again.
day.
Yeah.
And they kept coming.
And they kept coming. You know, Dr. Murimbani says that there might be something wrong with the core seed values of people who can do that. And I think that we at least need to be open to that idea. That there might be something wrong, that warfare that is considered acceptable by most people in the world is actually alien to you. And like George Washington did when he came to the United States, you don't only kill the people, you burn their fields. There's just no possibility for life after you're gone.
Their evidence that they ever lived.
Erase them. Yeah. So this was real new. This was real new and struck fear into the people who saw it. You know, it was really the new Jack on the block, you know, like, what? Yeah. Yeah. And so you have people really going out of their way to try to negotiate with this European in a way that would leave them with some advantage. But what we can see from the vestiges of this so-called trade that really never happened, that wasn't a trade, was just a stick-up, is that no, you almost got no advantage. You got a full disadvantage, really, because by the mid 1700s, 1 in every 3 African persons lived outside of Africa.
1 in every 3.
1 in every 3 lived outside of Africa. So now we're talking about raiding from the west coast of Africa, and from Central Africa and east, the raiding of Eurasians to bring them into Asia.
And then you talk about only 4% of the Africans that were taken wound up here.
In the United States.
And 96% wound up in the other Americas.
Yes, in the Caribbean and in South America. So a big piece of this puzzle is connecting with each other. I mean, let's just end the division today of whatever small island you're from, or if your family is from Brooklyn and mine is from, it's crazy. It serves no one's good, not among us. It may serve the good of the people who want to keep us in cycles of oppression. End that division. Get to know the family. Understand that the world has to become your neighborhood. We were scattered. We were dispersed, randomly in some cases, but for very calculated reasons.
I understand that the ways in which the ships were loaded, they deliberately picked people from different kinship groups who spoke different languages so that they could not communicate, and therefore plot escapes from their captors.
Absolutely.
You know, you didn't just go take the whole village and put the village on the same ship.
That's
because
right.
you would be sure to have mutiny.
That's right. And so what we see is something that we have to take a page from. Europeans were in the process of this human bondage, labor extraction and cultural extraction from Africa, becoming smarter with each shipment of Africans that they sent out. They noticed patterns. They wrote them down.
They studied.
They studied it. They were deliberate. They saw that language is our disadvantage. Language is their advantage. Let's put them at a disadvantage with language.
Because what sense do you make out of a world in which you speak no language? When you are not permitted to use your own language, there are very few people who share that language with you wherever you happen to be, on whatever plantation you happen to land on, be sold to. So now here you are. I am amazed that we learned English.
Yeah.
We taught English to ourselves.
Right.
We learned.
Right.
We deciphered.
We learned on the job, right?
Yes, we deciphered what was being said around us. We were able to read expressions.
That's right.
We were able to intuit things. We were able to anticipate things. We did a very good job of managing the slaveholders.
That's right.
Because they were vicious people who would do whatever they had a whim to do.
That's right.
And while I dislike Hollywood films that try to give us the narrative that comes out of Hollywood, I do like the fact that they do show some of this brutality, some of this experience, some of this process that was undergone.
Yes.
But of course we see that as being, the worst of it, and now, we've been emancipated and we're living happily ever after. But the thing is that you get to see the impulsive viciousness, how you can do whatever you like. So whatever you have a fancy toward doing, you just do it. Because this is your property and you can do what you like. And if you want to abuse it, if you want to destroy it, if you want to sell it, whatever you want to do to it, it's all right because you have divine order. You have the backing of the Most High who put you in charge
Right.
of this property, and you are custodians of this property, and therefore, you can do whatever you like. You can exercise free will.
Yeah. But one of the things that I find interesting is that I really like to underscore the fact that they knew that what they were doing was wrong. They knew that these were human beings and that this was not an acceptable way to treat them.
Absolutely.
But they did what they wanted to anyway. So they are never to be excused on the grounds that maybe he just didn't know and just thought that these were actually property, people he was holding as property. And one of the things that Hunter Adams sent me actually, and I'm so grateful for, is an article called The Night When the Stars Fell. I hope I'm saying that name right. It's some variation on that. And in the article, it refers back to a real event that happened in the United States, something akin to almost a meteor shower. I'm not a scientist, but that's kind of what happened. It was in the sky. You could see stars falling, what appeared like stars were falling from the sky. So we get several accounts from that, especially from the workers that went out during the Great Depression to collect the stories of the then living enslaved people, people who were still alive, having lived during the time of slavery. When they recorded their stories, many of them spoke about that night. That the stars seemingly fell from the sky. One really rich story that came out, though, is of a white family who, upon seeing this, assumed that this was the second coming of Christ. And they call their captive people together and began to say, I'm so sorry, this is who you are, this is who your mother is. This is where you belong. So giving the narrative back in effort to make their soul right in time for this coming of Christ. So they knew what they were doing was wrong.
Oh, yes, I agree. I just said, when I use the term impulse, I'm talking about after having done the deliberate things, then once you have people in captivity, then if it strikes you, oh, I think I want to have them stand on their head to entertain me, then you will do that. Those were the impulses that were free to roam after you have done the dire deed. I want to ask you about the law, the Amistad. We have 5 minutes. Can you say something about that before we leave? That that Black history must be taught, and that now you're working on the mathematics part of it to try to get it prepared to go into the curriculum.
Yes. So the Amistad Bill was originally crafted by the Chicago Council on Black Studies, and it is a bill which asks all public institutions in Illinois, all institutions receiving public funding, makes it mandatory for them to teach the truth of the African experience here in America, including the so-called enslavement period and all other things that follow. And also look at how the country benefited from this experience. And the bill has passed. The bill is funded. Curriculum is being created because, of course, you can always have a mandate, but teachers will say, there are no textbooks supporting this, and I wouldn't even know where to go to get resources to teach this. So we are eliminating that possibility by working on the Amistad project through the DeSable Museum to put together curriculum material that will answer exactly all the needs of a classroom teacher at most grade levels right now and all grade levels going into the future. Our goal is to create a database that they can go to and get the resources that are needed to teach the truth of the African experience in America.
Are you able to get funding, or is this volunteer work?
Well, teachers are being given a stipend to work on the project.
Okay.
And that's basically where it stands.
I think I thought the Amistad Society somehow was involved in this, but it's called the Amistad.
Well, the Amistad Commission, it's all working together. Yeah.
Okay.
There's a specific branch working on the academic
Okay.
end, and that's the end in which I'm involved,
Okay.
is getting the academic material together, creating a space that will be in the end online where teachers can go and get information. That's the part that I want to make sure that I do my duty to those who suffered and those who are suffering, that you remove every obstacle that a classroom teacher could possibly have to saying, I just can't do this.
And the final obstacle will be in-service training,
Yes.
because teachers need to be initiated, or the process needs to be facilitated. Just it's like putting books in a library. Or setting up a website. You have to have a search engine. Something has to lead you to that.
That's right.
And so to be motivated and to feel comfortable that you can do this work and that this is worthwhile work to do.
That's right. And we want to help teachers. And one of my biggest things, because this in the end is going to be in the hands of teachers of all races, is get past the guilt. If you are a non-African person using this curriculum, guilt is good, but don't let it stop you from teaching the truth of this. Guilt is something that can propel you forward, help you do some personal research, and it shouldn't work as an obstruction for you, where you can't get past
it's
it.
the right thing to do.
That's right.
And do it because this generation of the descendants of African people deserve.
That's right. And as Martin Luther King says, the truth is going to set us free and you free also.
Right,
We're
right.
all going to be better off
Right.
once we know this.
Right.
Suppressing information is just going to keep us at each other's throats, really.
And we could avoid repeating it.
That's right.
Thank you so much.
Thank
See,
you.
We did it.
We did.
And you didn't sneeze
One time. Thank you.
And you never used your map.
That's right.